Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wassalatu wassalamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Welcome everyone to what is our final lecture for this course, Fiqh of Worship number 1 of the Shafi'i Madhab. So today's course will conclude this unit, alhamdulillah, and of course in the other units we will continue our discussion. So what is left for us to conclude our discussion in today is to talk about all of the prerequisites, shara'at salah, all of the prerequisites of prayer. In the last lecture we left off, I started but was unable to get into all of it. So inshallah this class, or these lectures, will be for all of the prerequisites for prayer. So when we talk about the prerequisites for prayer, we are talking about the things prior to the salah that are an obligation for them to be in place. Some of these things will very much relate to what we talked about in the chapter of tahara, purity. So we will recall in many of these instances some of the definitions and the things that we talked about in the chapter of tahara, the chapter of purity. One of the things that we will also talk about is we will come to talk about the awra, or one's nakedness. And we will look at what are the parts of the body that need to be covered for the man and for the woman in order for their prayer to be valid. Related to this discussion, we will also mention some things about what are the parts of the body of the man and the woman that need to be covered or are allowed to be exposed when they're out in public. So that conversation of the awra inevitably leads into sort of generally how Muslims are supposed to dress appropriately in public. Now, when we talk about this specifically, we will also come to learn that there is a little bit of a difference, or there is another category in Islamic law, which is the traditional Islamic law, that is, which is the category of slavery. So this will probably be the first time that we make reference to slavery. This is not an endorsement of slavery, but that this is one of the things that we've inherited in our legal system to help us understand how certain rules are applied, even if there is no slavery, and we are happy that there is no slavery. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. But this will probably be one of the first times in which we introduce a reference to slavery. We'll also talk about the direction of the Kaaba, the Qibla, and some aspects, scientific aspects of how the Qibla place is determined. We will also go back and remember the prayer times and how the prayer times are determined. And lastly, we will look at some of the exceptions that Allah Ta'ala has given us from facing the Qibla, as well as we will look at some of the exceptions to these other prerequisites in cases of darura, of great need and necessity, as they come up, inshallah. Let us begin, as is our usual habit, by reading the Arabic text of the Matn of Abi Shuja' رضي الله عنه. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. فصل في شروط الصلاة. وشرائط الصلاة قبل الدخول فيها 5 أشياء: طهارة الأعداء من الحدث والنجس، وستر العورة بلباس طاهر، والوقوف على مكان طاهر، والعلم بدخول الوقت واستقبال القبلة. ويجوز ترك القبلة في حالتين: في شدة الخوف وفي النافلة في السفر على الراحلة. These are the section. As I said, we'll go back and we'll do a little bit of, we'll just start the section from anew. Now let me look at the book of Adillah, so we can look at some of the hadith related to that. Now, when it comes to the absence of hadath, let us not forget the most important dalil, which is verse 6 of Surah Al-Ma'idah: يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا قُمْتُمْ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ فَاغْسِلُوا بِوُجُوهِكُمْ وَأَيْدِيكُمْ إِلَى المرافق وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الكعبين. And to the end of that verse. So this is the verse of the wudu, and also mentioned in this verse is the dispensation, the rukhsa of tayammum. So ayah 6 of Surah Al-Ma'idah is very important for this regards. Now, when we talk about removing najasa, removing spiritually impure things, that the Prophet ﷺ told his daughter Fatima, told Fatima bint Abi Hubaysh radiallahu anha, if you have finished your period, if you start your menstrual cycle, leave off the prayer. If the menstrual cycle ends, then clean yourself from the impurities and pray. So the reference here is not just to make the tahara, not just to make the ghusl, but to also remove the impurities, which is, as we said, blood is considered an najasa. We also have the broader command for us to purify ourselves, which comes in Surah Al-Muddathir, verse 4, وَثِيَابَكَ فَطَهِّرْ, and this is a direct command to the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore for all of us is that we are to make our clothes pure, i.e. pure from ritual impurities, not pure from the point of view that they have to be fancy, but in this tahir, the tahara of the clothes is mean to make sure there is no filth on them, as we will come to dissect. We also have that the Prophet ﷺ, or we also have the verse خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ, every place of prayer to take your adornments. So covering ourselves, and also we will learn that it is a sunnah to go, especially if we're going to pray in congregation, to wear the best type of clothes that you can have. Knowing the time of the prayer. Allah Ta'ala says in the Quran in Surah An-Nisa verses 103, إِنَّ الصَّلَاةَ كَانَتَ عَلَى الْمُؤْمِنِينَ كِتَابًا مَوْقُوتًا, that the prayer has been given to us in its specific times. The reference is, well, then you need to know what those times are to be able to know when to pray. The hadith that we mentioned earlier in another lecture about the man who urinated in the mosque and then the Prophet ﷺ threw water over it is one of the adillah that we use to talk about the obligation to make sure that the place that we pray is free from any ritual impurities. As far as the not facing the qibla in times of fear, the main dalil for that is verse 239 in Surah Al-Baqarah, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ فَرِجَالًا أَوْ رُكْبَانًا. The Sahaba interpreted that if you are scared that you can pray standing or sitting, i.e. in any mode that is needed due to the extreme amount of fear. And then as far as the Prophet ﷺ praying the nafil prayer, the sunnah prayer, while he was riding, which is a well-known thing, this is narrated in Bukhari, on the authority of Jabir radiallahu anhu, who said that the Prophet ﷺ used to pray on his riding mount, not facing the Qibla. If it was a Qibla, then he would descend, face the Qibla, and continue his prayer. Okay, so these are some of the adillah that will concern and occupy us for our discussion. I'm also going to bring our friend the Hashia as we begin this discussion, because I know that there were a couple of things that I wanted to mention as we begin the talk. Okay, so let us go back to the beginning. Oh, I think I forgot to read the English translation, but I guess we'll just do that as we go along for the sake of time. So he says, rahimahullah, that there are 5 prerequisites for prayer. So every time we are going to have an act in the Sharia, we are always going to look at what are the prerequisites for that act. Oftentimes the prerequisites for that act will simply be that one is mukallaf, which we talked about extensively in a previous lecture. When we talk about zakah, okay, we all know that we need to pay zakah, but what are the things that make the zakah an obligation, i.e. the things that happen beforehand, the prerequisites, the shara'at. So the shurut, the conditions of something, are from the ahkam al-wada'iyya, the rulings that Allah Ta'ala has established. Who has made these prerequisites for us? Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. So just like we have the 5 legal rulings that something is wajib or haram, mubah, mandub, makruh, etc. There are those five. There's another set that are called al-ahkam al-wada'iyya, those established. Not that we want to get too much into usul al-fiqh, but I just want people to understand how the structure of the legal discussion on writings go. And this will be the same for all madhahib and all over. This is like a universal thing. So these are the things that Allah Ta'ala has made as a prerequisite for our prayer to be valid. One of the things that you will learn if you read these and you think about them and you reflect on them, one of the things that will be clear that all of these things mean that when you stand to pray, you are standing and praying based on certainty. In other words, you have achieved certainty that you are clean, you have achieved certainty that your clothes are clean. When I say you are clean, that you have wudu, you are certain that your clothes are clean, you are certain that the place you are praying is clean, you are certain that the time has come in, you are certain that you are facing the qibla. As we will see specifically when it comes to facing the qibla and the times, you can't do that on a hunch. You have to arrive at some degree of certainty, and there are different ways of doing it. We'll go through them. So when you stand and you say Allahu Akbar and you pray, then that prayer is based on yaqeen. It's based on certainty. Now this is very important because we are not allowed to base our faith based on doubt. And that's why one of the principles we have in the Sharia is al-yaqeenu la yazulu bishak, that certainty is not violated or not erased through doubt. So what is certain is stronger, and what lasts. What is doubtful is that which comes and goes. So when we talk about these things, even though it seems like these are simple things, and that now we just sort of maybe we don't think about a lot of these things because we take them for granted, like prayer apps and the mihrab in the mosque and things like that. But you have to understand that all of those are based on some kind of direct practice that leads us to a degree of certainty. Related to the issue of certainty is also the fact that we don't fast the day of doubt, what might be the 30th of Sha'ban. If today is the 29th of Sha'ban and we're not sure if tomorrow is Ramadan or not, this is called Yawm al-Shak. It's even called the day of doubt. And despite, there's fiqh differences of opinion whether it's haram or makruh to fast that day. But the issue is the reason we call it the day of doubt is that we have not officially started the month of Ramadan. So if you follow the ibadat, one of the meta themes that was like a string that weaves through all of the ibadat that we're going to discuss, the tahara, the prayer, the zakah, the fasting, and the hajj and the umrah, which are basically our 5 pillars. If you look at all of those, one of the meta themes of them is that it inculcates in its practitioners yaqeen, certainty. And that's why when you study fiqh, you need to see it as a precise science, that this is not something that is maybe, sort of, kind of. No, there are definitions and there are conditions and prerequisites, and all of that leads you to have certainty. So before you act, you are certain in what you're going to act on, inshallah. Okay, so he says there are 5 prerequisites for prayer. The first is the absence of impurity, hadath, and inexcusable filth. Hadath are the things that make you lose your wudu. There's al-hadath al-asghar and al-hadath al-akbar. So al-hadath al-asghar, the smaller hadath, is you pass wind, you go to the bathroom, you touch your privates, the things that we talked about, you pass out, etc., the things that we talked about in the previous book. And then there's the hadath al-akbar, which is the greater state of ritual impurity, which are things that are shared by men and women, and then there are things, of course, that are specific to women only. Just wanted to look at something really quickly in the previous chapter. Okay. So, one is you can't pray unless you have wudu. You can't have wudu if you've lost your wudu and not made wudu, or if you've entered into a state of janaba and you haven't made the ghusl. When you make the ghusl is stronger than and incorporates within it the wudu. So even though there's a sunnah of making the wudu as you do the ghusl, if you make the ghusl alone with its conditions as we discussed, then you have wudu as well. So you have to have the absence of the state of hadath. What is going to lift the hadath is the wudu and or the ghusl, And of course, we know that the tayammum does not lift the state of the hadith, but allows us to pray, and we talked about the details of that there. And then related to that is you have no filth on you that is inexcusable. We talked about excusable amounts of filth, which is if you took a little coin amount of filth on your body. If you really, it's determined by an urf, custom. So if I think I use the example because I'm a man, sometimes you shave and you get a little cut, and sometimes the blood falls down on your collar. If it's a couple of drops of blood, that would be excusable. That's okay. But if you were outside in the yard playing and a nail cut you made a big gash here and you have a lot of blood, that's not excusable. That you need to clean that, take off your shirt, wash it, so on and so forth. So that's why he says inexcusable, the absence of inexcusable filth. In other words, there is some filth that is considered excusable. What is the determining factor for that? What is customary? So if you walk into a mosque, what people would say, oh, you just have a little bit of something here, that's what we would call excusable. But if you walked in with a lot and people would naturally say, don't mess up, don't dirty the mosque, then you know that is not excusable, and then that needs to be removed. So we talked a little bit about that in the previous lecture, so we don't have to belabor it. Okay, number 2 is covering one's nakedness with clothes that are pure, the awra, satrul awra. So let's go through that, and there will be some details. The first thing that we need to say about the awra is what he means by covering one's nakedness is covering the color of one's skin, not necessarily the shape of the body. In other words, you can't wear something transparent that covers you from head to toe and say that you've covered your awra, because you can still see. So what is specifically meant is lawn al-awra, the color of one's nakedness or one's body, but not necessarily the shape. So if you wore something very tight, skin tight, but it was covered, that would be considered covering your awra, but disliked. It's makruh. And this is very important because a lot of this will have to do with women's fashion and men's fashion. I meant modern fashion. Sorry, I didn't mean women's fashion. I said modern fashion. And you will see a lot of people on the different, scale of culturally conservative or not conservative. They will have a lot of negative things to say, specifically as it relates to women's clothes. What concerns us here is the Quran and Sunnah and interpreting it, not necessarily getting into these cultural battles and debates. Women and men's clothes that are very tight, as long as they cover the skin color of the skin, then they have fulfilled covering the awra. Even if it's like skin tight, it would be considered makruh. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, of course, there are going to be different levels of awra for men and women. So that's what I wanted to go through. Of course, I think he says it here, right? Yeah, that are pure. So you have to cover yourself with pure substance. There is an overall prohibition in the Sharia to put on najasa on yourself on purpose. Atadakhum bin najasat, it's called. So you have to make sure that your clothes are pure, and that is what you are using to cover your awra. So let's start with the man. For the man, the man's awra is between the navel and the knees. Most of the fuqaha of the madhab say that the navel itself and the knees themselves are not included in the awra. However, as we discussed washing the face, and we said in order to get the top part, you must go to part of the head. It's the same thing with the awra. To ensure that your belly button is, your waist is covered, you will have to cover part of your navel, because it has to be above that, because you move around. And to ensure that your knee, right above your knees are covered, you will inevitably have to, if you're a man, have to cover your knees, because as you go down for sujood and things like that, the pants or the shorts or whatever don't come up. So the way that you would actually do it in real life is to cover slightly above the navels to below the knees, knowing that the navel and the knees, in some opinions in the madhab, are not included themselves in the awra, but they need to be covered, or else you will not be able to ensure what needs to be covered is covered. So the awra for the man in prayer is as I mentioned it. But there is an awra of the man in public. So a man, other than for necessity, is not supposed to go out in public like that, and rather their whole body should be covered. Now, when it comes to a woman's awrah for prayer is everything except her face and her hands. And this, we know, this comes from the famous hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, to Asma. So a woman can show in prayer her hands and her face, but her feet need to be covered, the top and the bottom part, in the Shafi'i madhab. Of course, this is a difference of opinion, because in the Hanafi madhab she can show her feet, but because we're teaching the traditional Shafi'i madhab, we're going to just try to stay within our lanes and not talk about outside of the lanes. So in the prayer, the woman's awrah is everything will be covered except her face and her hands. Now, when you read the hashiyah, in any hashiyah, it will say, but when a woman goes outside, her whole body needs to be covered. Now, that doesn't necessarily contradict what we just said, nor is that necessarily a fard, because if it was an obligation for a woman to cover her face, then she would have to have covered her face in the prayer itself. So those are cultural expressions that at the time that these hawashi and stuff were written, it was normal that women would go out like that. And in many Muslim countries today, not many, but in several Muslim countries or Muslim majority populations, it's extremely normal for women to cover their face. But in many other type of Muslim majority nations, it's not. So technically speaking, the awrah is not the face for the woman, so therefore we would say that the niqab or the face covering is a sunnah and not a fard. Now, related to that is another mas'ala that comes up from time to time. It's not necessarily in the discussion, but because, sometimes when you mention something, you're reminded of something else. Is the voice of a woman? Is the voice of a woman awrah? Well, we have no text that says the voice of the woman is awrah, but you will find in some traditional books that say, and her voice is an awrah. Because of these type of statements, if she goes out, all of her body should be covered. So they're thinking, well then, it's only logical then her voice is an awrah. But not so, because there's no dalil for that. And as a matter of fact, we have dalil for the opposite, that women used to speak publicly in the mosque with the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba, etc. Okay. So that would be the nakedness. I'm actually not going to talk about the nakedness of the slave girl, because I don't think it's necessary now, and I was thinking of another discussion point. I think it will come later in this chapter of prayer, so I'll just wait till we get to that part rather than make an unnecessary reference to that now. So for right now, what we need to remember is the awrah of the man vis-a-vis prayer, because that's the discussion we are in here, is from the navel to the knees, and that's the minimum that a man needs to cover to pray, and what is covering him has to be pure. And the minimum that a woman needs to cover for the prayer is everything except her face and her hands, including her feet, and what she covers herself with has to be pure. So here the context is specifically what are the prerequisites for the prayer, and inshallah in the next clip we'll talk about the other ones, inshallah. Okay, number 3, praying on something that is pure. So the place that you pray has to be tahir. Now, if you find a place in which there's najasa on the floor, but you put something tahir on top of it, that would be okay. Or you could clean it. That would also be okay. What happens if you pray and there is some najasa around you? Well, if the najasa is dry, then the najasa-ness of the dry najasa does not transfer. Remember when we talked about the dog and the pig, etc., that what transfers is the wetness, not the dryness. So if your hand is dry and you touch a piece of najasa that is dry, that najasa does not transfer to your hands. So if, let's say, you're praying out in the forest or the desert or something like that, and you're making sujood and your hands come near some dung or something like that you didn't see. If it's dry, then that's an excusable thing because it's not going to transfer to you. But definitely you need to make the effort to find and make sure that the place that you are praying is pure. One of the things that he says, which was interesting, and I wanted to mention it because it's something that actually is still valid today, is if you are in a public place, let's say in a city, for example, in which there's a lot of bird poop around, like pigeons and I don't know, ducks and things like that. Sometimes you find that there are just some cities that are like that. He actually says praying in a place like that is excusable because it's almost impossible to to clean it or to find elsewhere. Assuming you can't, and assuming that there's not enough time, of course. As a practicing Muslim, you're always going to make the effort to find a place that's clean to pray. I mean, who wants to pray on filth like that? But it's interesting that he mentions that in some circumstances there might be so much najasa around that it's very almost impossible for you to ensure that it is clean. So praying on something that is pure means being certain that the place that you are praying has no najasa, has no urine, has no feces, wet or dry for that matter, has no blood. These are the things that we talked about that would be considered najis. And if there is places in which those are in existence, you can either clean them with water, as we've mentioned before, or you can put something clean on top of it and pray on top of it, because what you are praying on top of in that case would then be najis. Okay, and then he says, knowing that the prayer time has entered. Okay, this we're going to spend a little bit of time on, knowing that the prayer time has entered. So the science of the prayer time, that's why the chapter begins with the prayer times. And I mentioned to you that there used to be people that was their expertise, that was their job, is that they knew how to read the elements, the astrological elements, and know the beginning of the times, the movements of the shadows, and things like that. So either you have that knowledge yourself and you are looking up and seeing, okay, the prayer time has come in, or you are relying on something. Certain animals make certain noises at certain times, or you're looking at certain tables that are reliable, or calculation tables that are reliable. Either one of those things means that you have gained the knowledge that the time has entered. So he actually mentions using prayer tables in the Hashia as something that gives you definitive knowledge that the time has come in. So a lot of people, from time to time, not a lot of people, but people from time to time will challenge, the prayer tables and the apps and things like that. But as long as the science behind them is sound and that there are ulama that are guiding the scientific process, then that also yields a knowledge that the prayer time has come in. What you can't do is you can't just say, I think it's dhuhr and pray. Because if you think, then you have introduced doubt and you have not based your prayer on yaqeen. Now, one of the interesting masail that he brings up is what happens if you pray, let's go with Salatul Fajr. If you pray Fajr for like a year and it turns out that you have been praying it early, before the time, or you were praying it late, after the time, does that mean you have to make up a whole year? He says no, the only thing that you have to make up is one prayer. Because each prayer that you prayed in the wrong time is a made-up prayer of the day before, and then the next day you prayed it at the wrong time, it's a make-up for the day before, so on and so forth. And that's an interesting mas'ala fiqhiyya. In that case, you would only have to make up one fard. But to avoid that problem altogether, you need to know when the prayer time has come. So either you're going to follow somebody who's knowledgeable, or you're going to learn the things yourself, as hopefully now you're learning, and be able to determine for yourself whether the tables that you're using or relying on, the apps that you're using or relying on, are sound or not sound. If you're going to do that, my advice is that you have to be mutabahir, you have to be very expansive in your knowledge about the prayer times, because you have to be able to incorporate all of the different fiqhi positions. We are only presenting one madhab, because when you deal with something like published prayer times, you're dealing with the ibadat of a whole population of people that have a lot of diversity, and you don't want to be responsible for making things difficult for anybody. So even though we are teaching the madhab of Sidna Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, when you do something that is of a public service, you really have to encompass all of the fiqh to make sure that you are determining what is correct for people. Okay, so knowing that the prayer time has entered and facing the direction of prayer. Facing the direction of prayer. In the Shafi'i madhab, we have to be as precise and as exact in facing Mecca as possible. This brings up a couple of side fiqh issues. Facing the Qibla. First of all, the Qibla of all of the Anbiya was Jerusalem, including the first Qibla of Sayyidina Muhammad ﷺ, until it was changed to Mecca. So one of the things that we are blessed with as an ummah is that we have the Kaaba al-Musharrafa as our Qibla. And that's the direction that all Muslims that say the kalima face when they pray. Remember when we talked about wudu, we defined the face as being from here to here. So as long as any part of this faces the Qibla, let's say the Qibla is directly towards the camera, but I end up praying like this, well, I'm still facing the Qibla, right? So my prayer would be valid. Of course, you try to be as exact as you can, but I'm just saying when you're far away, thousands of miles away from Mecca, you need to know the different fiqh rules to be able to apply it. Another related fiqh point is that the airspace above the Kaaba is from the Kaaba. So there are certain times of year in which the sun is directly above the Kaaba. I can't remember what the day is or time of the year is, but I know that part is true. So let's say you saw the sun that day that it was directly above the Kaaba, and you were, hundreds if not thousands of miles away. That means that is you are looking at the Qibla directly, because the space above the Qibla is from the space above the Kaaba is from the Kaaba itself. So there are some things to remember as it regards to fiqh. Of course, for those of you that live in other places that are not in the heartland of the Muslim world, then you need to use the precise measuring techniques. I think it's called the Great Circle Method, to be able to determine the direction of the Qibla, which is basically the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. So whatever the straight line is from where you are to Mecca, that is going to be the Qibla direction, facing the direction of the Qibla. However, he says in concluding this section, in 2 situations it is permissible to deviate from the direction of prayer. So these things that we just mentioned are 5 obligations that you have to have before you pray. But when can you not face the Qibla? Number 1, if there's intense fear. Intense fear meaning fear in battle, or you're fleeing from a tyrant, or somebody's chasing you. In those situations, you're not going to stop and face the Qibla and pray. You're just going to do what you need to do. And the fuqaha say in the heat of battle, even if somebody was actually fighting, an actual fighting battle and a legitimate battle, they said, Allahu Akbar, that would count as their prayer. They wouldn't even have to go through the motions because of the intense fear, nor would they even have to make it up in that circumstance. And I think the fear prayer will come much later. So if there's intense fear not just from fighting in a battle, but it could be also you're like in retreat from an enemy, or somebody's chasing you or about to harm you or kill you, etc. And then if praying the non-obligatory prayers, the sunnah prayers during traveling while riding. So that's another exception, and we read the hadith about that the Prophet ﷺ, it was known that he would pray those sunnah prayers as he was riding on his animal, but he would not face the Qibla for them. So those are the 2 exceptions that you have for not facing the Qibla. And this will bring our discussion to a close, inshallah, and we'll have the recap video next. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa alam. So in today's lecture, we were able to cover the prerequisites for prayer. We learned a little bit about where prerequisites come from the usul al-fiqh point of view, and why it's important to know as we engage in Sharia acts. Almost all of the ibadat acts certainly will have them, and many of the muamalat acts will have prerequisites. And a lot of the fiqh that people lack is actually in learning what those prerequisites are. For the prerequisites of prayer, we talked about the 5 well-known prerequisites: the absence of the hadath and najasa. This took us a little bit back to our discussion in fiqh, and we talked a little bit about najasa being excusable and inexcusable. Then we talked about the awrah for men and women, and a little bit of the details of that, linking back to some fiqhi principles that we talked about previously in the chapter of Tahara, about going over what is necessary to ensure that you have what is necessary. Or as we state it more properly, مَا لَا يَتِمُّ الْوَاجِبُ إِلَّا بِهِ فَهُوَ وَاجِبٌ. And then We talked about praying on a place that is pure, ensuring that where you are is pure, and if for some reason you encounter najasa, how to clean that najasa and do away with it. And then we talked about knowing when the prayer time has come in, and how that this is very important to arrive at some kind of certainty, either learning how to calculate the prayer times, or relying on prayer tables, or in the modern extension apps that are reliable, that the science and fiqh behind them are reliable. And the same goes with facing the qibla. But what we can't do is just think that the time has come in, and we just can't think that this is the direction of the prayer, but rather we have to make the effort to arrive at what we feel is certainty, that the direction and the time has come in and the direction is proper. We talked a little bit about the direction of the prayer, about how the space above the Kaaba is also considered part of the Kaaba, and how there are certain times of the year where the sun is directly over the Kaaba, and if you observe that from where you live, then you are in a sense looking directly at the Kaaba, and that's a way to definitively know where the Qibla is. But there are other scientific methods like the Great Circle method for those that live very far away in other continents that are beneficial to learn. The Qibla, which is essentially going to be the shortest distance between 2 points, is a straight line. So whatever straight line is, and of course a straight line on a globe is curved, that is going to be the Qibla. And then we talked about two exceptions of facing the Qibla. One is out of intense fear, either fear in warfare or fear in retreat from harm's way. And we talked about how the actual prayer of fear will come at the end of this chapter, so we can just save the discussion for then. And then lastly, we talked about how the Prophet ﷺ used to pray his sunnah prayers, not facing the Qibla while on a riding animal as he was traveling, and this was one of his habits, and we read that hadith in the beginning of the lecture. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.